Daniel's hands were shaking when the bank manager finished speaking, his voice no longer carrying the quiet authority it once had but cracking under the weight of facts laid bare in front of him. Every unauthorized transfer traced, every hidden payment documented, every account they thought I would never check now sitting in a neat stack of evidence between us. And for the first time since that dinner, Rebecca wasn't smiling. Her perfectly rehearsed composure fractured into something raw and desperate as she realized there was no version of this conversation she could manipulate. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't need to, because the number spoke louder than any accusation ever could. 93 payments, each one a quiet theft dressed up as help. Each one a reminder of exactly how far they had gone, thinking I was too old, too slow, too irrelevant to notice. Daniel tried to speak, tried to say it was a misunderstanding, that it wasn't what it looked like, but even he couldn't meet my eyes when the bank manager slid the final document across the table confirming restricted access had been revoked and legal review initiated. Rebecca's voice finally broke through, sharp and panicked, asking how I could do this to my own family, and that was when I allowed myself the smallest smile, not cruel, not loud, just precise, because for the first time they were the ones reacting while I remained still. "You already did this to yourselves," I said, my tone calm enough to make the words land heavier than anger ever could. By the time we left the bank, their credit lines were frozen, their shared accounts locked pending investigation, and the illusion of control they had built their lives on was already collapsing. 2 days later, in my lawyer's office, I signed the final version of my will, the one that removed their names entirely and replaced them with provisions that ensured every dollar I had built over a lifetime would never again pass through hands that saw me as disposable. There was no dramatic confrontation when I handed Daniel the notice, no shouting, no pleading, just silence stretching between us as he read the document that confirmed what they had lost, not just the money, but the future they had already spent in their minds. Rebecca tried one last time, her voice softer now, almost sweet, asking if we could fix this, if we could talk. But there was nothing left to fix because trust doesn't survive being itemized into 93 separate betrayals. I walked out of that house without looking back, not because I was hurt, but because there was nothing behind me worth carrying forward anymore. The last thing I did before closing that chapter was cancel the final pending transaction they had set up in my name, watching the confirmation message appear on my screen with a quiet finality that felt cleaner than any revenge. They said I was too old to handle money, and maybe that was their biggest mistake because what I handled instead was the truth, and by the time they realized it, I had already taken everything back, every account, every decision, every piece of control they thought they had stolen, leaving them with exactly what they had earned. Nothing but the consequences of underestimating the one person who never stopped paying attention. "You're too old to handle money now, Margaret," my daughter-in-law said, her voice light but sharp enough to cut through the quiet of the dining room. And my son didn't correct her, didn't even look at me, just kept eating as if that sentence had always been true and I was the only one hearing it for the first time. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate, my hand steady in a way that surprised even me, because something in that moment didn't break. It clicked into place. Like a lock I hadn't realized had been tampered with for years. The house felt different after that dinner, not louder, not colder, just wrong, as if every familiar corner had shifted a few inches while I wasn't looking. And I found myself noticing things I had ignored before. The way Rebecca hovered whenever I opened my checkbook, the way Daniel would casually ask about my expenses, as if he had a right to audit a life I had built long before he learned how to write his own name. I had always told myself they were helping, that this was what family did, stepping in, making things easier, especially after my husband passed and the silence of the house became something I had to learn how to live with. But that night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I replayed her words again and again. Not because they hurt, but because they didn't feel new. They felt like the final piece of something that had been quietly forming behind my back. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, before the sun had fully risen, and for a moment I almost convinced myself to let it go, to chalk it up to stress or misunderstanding. But then I walked into the kitchen and saw the stack of mail I hadn't opened, envelopes marked with familiar logos but unfamiliar amounts, and something told me to stop. Ignoring what was right in front of me, I made a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, the same table where I had raised my son, where birthdays had been celebrated and holidays planned, and I started opening each envelope one by one, my eyes moving slowly over numbers that didn't make sense, payments I didn't remember authorizing, subscriptions I had never signed up for, charges that repeated month after month like a quiet leak draining something I hadn't realized was disappearing. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, a bank error, something technical that could be explained with a simple phone call. But the more I looked, the more a pattern emerged, not random, not accidental, but deliberate, structured, almost careful in the way it avoided drawing attention. And that was when I felt it, not panic, not anger, but clarity. I reached for my phone and logged into my account, navigating through pages I hadn't visited in months, maybe years, and there it was, a list of transactions stretching back further than I expected, each one small enough to seem insignificant on its own, but together forming something much larger, something that had been building while I trusted the people sitting across from me at dinner. I didn't call Daniel, I didn't confront Rebecca, because for the first time, I understood that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be solved with a conversation. And as I sat there in the quiet morning light, scrolling through numbers that told a story no one had bothered to explain to me, I realized something else, something far more important than the money itself. They didn't think I would notice. And that was exactly why I finally did. I did not sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind would not let go of the numbers, each one sitting behind my eyes like a quiet question waiting for an answer. And by the time the sun came up again, I had already made a decision that surprised even me. I was not going to confront anyone yet, I was going to watch. The house moved as it always did the next morning, Rebecca making coffee with that polished efficiency she liked to display, Daniel scrolling through his phone at the counter, both of them acting as though nothing had changed, and maybe for them it had not, because they still believed the same thing they had said out loud the night before, that I was no longer capable of understanding what was happening around me. I sat at the table with my own cup of coffee, the same chair I had used for decades, and I observed everything with a kind of stillness that felt new. The way Rebecca casually mentioned a bill that needed to be paid before I even had the chance to open my mail, the way Daniel nodded along without asking me, without even pretending that the decision was mine, and I realized that this was not something that had started recently. This had been building slowly, carefully, over time until it became normal. Later that morning when they left the house, I returned to the stack of papers in my online account, this time not with confusion, but with intention. I started writing everything down in a small notebook I had kept in the kitchen drawer for years, every transaction, every date, every amount, and as the list grew longer, so did the pattern: payments tied to services I had never used, subscriptions linked to email addresses that were not mine, transfers that seemed to circle back into accounts I did not recognize but could guess the purpose of. I paused at one particular charge, a monthly payment that had been running for nearly 2 years, always on the same day, always the same amount, and I tried to remember if I had ever approved something like that, but there was nothing, no memory, no signature. No conversation, just a quiet deduction repeated so many times it had blended into the background of my life. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the kitchen, the cabinets I had chosen, the walls I had painted, the small details that once made this house feel like it belonged to me, and for the first time, I saw how easily that sense of ownership could be taken away without anyone raising their voice, without any obvious conflict, just a series of small decisions made on my behalf until there was nothing left that was truly mine. I did not cry, I did not feel anger in the way people expect, instead there was something colder, something clearer. A recognition that trust had been treated like a resource to be used rather than something to be protected, and that realization settled into me with a quiet weight that did not need to be expressed to be understood. By the time Daniel and Rebecca returned that evening, I had already filled several pages with notes, my handwriting neat and deliberate, my thoughts organized in a way they had not been the day before, and when Rebecca asked if I had seen the mail, I simply nodded and said yes, watching her expression for a fraction of a second. Too long, long enough to notice the flicker of something behind her eyes, something that told me she knew more than she was saying. I did not push, I did not question, because I understood now that the truth was not something they were going to give me, it was something I was going to have to take back piece by piece, and as I closed my notebook and placed it back in the drawer, I realized that whatever they had started, they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed I would never look closely enough to see it. The next morning, I did something I had not done in years. I left the house without telling anyone where I was going, not out of defiance, but because I needed to see something for myself without their presence shaping the answers, and as I drove to the bank, I kept replaying every small moment that had once seemed harmless, every time Rebecca offered to handle things, every time Daniel reassured me that I did not need to worry about the details, and I realized how easily concern can be used as a disguise for control when you trust the people offering it. The bank lobby was quiet when I walked in, the kind of quiet that makes every step feel louder than it is, and when I sat down with the manager, a man I had met years ago when my husband was still alive, I noticed the slight hesitation in his expression when I asked to review all activity tied to my accounts, as if he was trying to understand why I was only asking now. I explained calmly that I wanted a full printout, everything, no summaries, no simplifications, just the facts, and he nodded, though I could tell he was adjusting his expectations of me in real time. When the documents were placed in front of me, the weight of them felt heavier than paper should, page after page of transactions that told a story I had only begun to see, and as I turned each sheet, I found confirmations of what I already suspected: recurring payments authorized through linked access, secondary approvals granted from devices that were not mine, and changes to account settings that I did not remember making. I pointed to a section that listed authorized users, my voice steady as I asked who had been given permission to manage these transactions, and when he read the names out loud, Daniel Collins and Rebecca Collins, something inside me settled completely, not shattered, not even surprised, just settled, because the last piece of uncertainty was gone. I asked when that access had been granted, and he showed me the date, nearly 2 years ago, a time when I had been grieving, when paperwork had been overwhelming, when I had trusted them to help me navigate what I could not face alone, and I understood then that what had begun as assistance had quietly turned into something else entirely. The manager asked if I wanted to revoke access immediately, his tone careful, respectful, but I shook my head, not yet, because I needed to see how far this went, how deep the pattern extended, and more importantly, I needed to understand how they thought this would end. I thanked him for the documents and walked out with a folder tucked under my arm, the edges pressing lightly against my side with each step, a constant reminder that what I was holding was not just information, it was leverage. On the drive home, I did not turn on the radio, I did not distract myself. I simply let the silence fill the space as I began to connect everything: the comments about my age, the subtle shifts in decision-making, the way my role in my own life had been reduced without me noticing, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, I knew something they did not. They thought this was about money, but it was not. It was about control, and they had just shown me exactly how they had taken it. That evening, I placed the folder on the kitchen counter exactly where Rebecca would see it, not opened, not hidden, just present like a quiet test, and when she walked in, her eyes flickered toward it for less than a second before she looked away. But it was enough, because people only avoid what they recognize. Daniel came in shortly after, loosening his tie, asking about dinner in the same casual tone he had used his entire life. And I answered him the same way I always had, calm, measured, giving nothing away because I needed them to feel comfortable, to believe that nothing had changed. We sat down together, the three of us, and for a moment it almost felt like any other evening: plates placed neatly, utensils aligned, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background, but underneath it all there was a tension that only I seemed to acknowledge, a quiet awareness that every word mattered now. Rebecca brought up a bill again, something about a service that needed to be renewed, and she spoke as if it was routine, as if I would simply agree like I always had. But this time I asked a question, a simple one: how long have we been paying for that? And the pause that followed was small, almost invisible, but it stretched just enough for me to see the hesitation she could not hide. Daniel answered instead, quickly, too quickly, saying it had been a while, that it was necessary, that everything was under control, and I nodded, letting the conversation move on, because I was not interested in catching them off guard. I was interested in understanding how deeply they believed their own version of reality. Later that night, when the house had settled into silence, I returned to my room and opened the folder again, spreading the documents across my bed, each page a piece of a timeline I was beginning to reconstruct, and as I traced the dates with my finger, I noticed something else: the timing of the changes, the access granted shortly after my husband passed, the gradual increase in activity over the following months, the way everything accelerated once I stopped questioning small discrepancies, and it became clear that this was not impulsive, it was planned, not in a dramatic sense, but in a slow, patient way that relied on my trust more than anything else. I sat there for a long time, not overwhelmed, not even angry, just thinking, connecting moments I had once dismissed, the conversations where Rebecca insisted she could handle things faster online, the times Daniel reassured me that I did not need to worry about details, the subtle shift from assistance to authority that I had allowed because it felt easier in the moment. I realized then that the most dangerous part of all of this was not the money itself, it was how quietly they had rewritten my role in my own life, how easily I had been moved from decision-maker to observer without ever being told it was happening. I closed the folder and placed it back on the counter before going to bed, not as evidence, not yet, but as a reminder to myself that I was no longer guessing, I was seeing clearly, and as I turned off the lights I understood something that changed everything. They believed they were in control because I had not challenged them, but control that depends on silence is fragile, and for the first time in a very long time I was no longer silent. The next morning I did not reach for the phone or the documents right away. Instead I sat in the quiet of the living room with a notebook in my lap, the same one I had started filling the day before, and I began to rewrite everything in a way that made the pattern impossible to ignore. Not just dates and numbers but context, where I had been, what I had been told, what I had believed at the time, and as I connected those details, something even clearer emerged. This had not been a single decision, it had been a series of calculated steps that relied on my trust at each stage. I remembered the first time Rebecca had suggested helping me streamline my bills, how she smiled as she explained how easy it would be, how Daniel stood beside her nodding as if it was the most reasonable thing in the world, and I remembered how relieved I had felt in that moment, how I had signed a form without reading it carefully because I believed I was making life simpler for all of us. I paused my pen and looked around the room, noticing how many things in this house still reflected choices I had made years ago, yet somehow those choices no longer extended to the parts of my life that mattered most. I turned the page and started listing the recurring charges again, this time grouping them, separating what might have been legitimate from what clearly was not, and as I did, I realized that nearly all of the questionable transactions were tied to services that benefited someone else, upgraded plans, subscriptions linked to newer devices, expenses that aligned more with Daniel and Rebecca's lifestyle than mine, and the realization did not sting the way it might have before. It settled like a truth finally given the space to exist without denial. Around mid-morning, Rebecca walked through the room, her phone in her hand, her expression briefly tightening when she saw me writing, and she asked casually what I was doing. Her tone light but her eyes focused in a way that told me she was paying attention now. And I simply said I was organizing things, which was not a lie, just not the full truth. She lingered for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded and moved on, but I could feel the shift, subtle but real, as if something in the balance of our roles had begun to tilt. Later, Daniel came in and mentioned that he might need to review some upcoming payments, saying it in the same tone he always used when discussing matters that had slowly become his responsibility instead of mine. And I agreed, watching him relax slightly, as if my compliance confirmed that everything was still within his control. But as the day moved forward, I continued writing, continued mapping out the full scope of what had been taken and how it had been done, and with each page my hesitation faded, replaced by a steady clarity that did not need emotion to sustain it. By the time evening came, I had counted them, every single one, 93 payments, 93 separate decisions made without me, and I closed the notebook slowly, not with anger, but with a quiet certainty that what I held in my hands was not just a record, it was the beginning of taking everything back. The next step did not come from anger, it came from precision, because once I understood the scope of what had been done, I also understood that reacting emotionally would only give them time to adjust, and I was no longer interested in giving them that advantage. Instead, I chose something they would never expect from me. I chose patience, the kind that watches quietly while everything aligns into place. That afternoon, I made a call I had not made in years, to the one person my husband had always trusted with everything we built, Mr. Harrison, and when he answered, his voice carried the same steady professionalism I remembered. But there was also something else, recognition, as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than I had. I told him I needed to review my financial authority and legal standing, nothing more, no details, and he agreed to meet the next morning without hesitation. When I arrived at his office, the familiar scent of polished wood and old paper greeted me, grounding me in something that still felt solid, something that had not shifted without my consent, and as I sat across from him, placing my notebook in the folder on his desk, I watched his expression carefully as he began to read. He did not interrupt, did not react immediately, he simply turned each page with measured attention, and when he finally looked up, there was no confusion in his eyes, only confirmation. He asked one question, did I authorize any of this knowingly, and I answered, simply no. He nodded once, then leaned back slightly, explaining in calm, precise terms what I already suspected but needed to hear from someone outside the situation, that the authority I had granted had been extended beyond its original purpose, that access had been used in ways that were legally questionable, and most importantly, that none of it removed my ownership, my control, or my right to revoke everything at any time. The words settled into me with a clarity that felt almost physical, because they shifted something fundamental, not just what had happened but what could happen next. He outlined the options, not dramatically, not emotionally, but strategically: revoke access immediately, freeze unauthorized activities, document everything for legal protection, and if necessary pursue further action. But what stayed with me was not the list itself, it was the quiet assurance beneath it, that I had never actually lost control, I had only stepped back from it. I asked him one more question: if I chose to act without warning, without discussion, could I do it cleanly without giving them time to interfere? And his answer was simple: yes. When I left his office, the folder felt different in my hands, not heavier but sharper, like a tool instead of a burden. And as I drove home, I did not feel rushed, I did not feel uncertain, because for the first time since this began, I was not reacting to what they had done, I was preparing for what I was about to do, and that difference changed everything. When I returned home, I did not go straight to the kitchen or the living room like I usually did. Instead, I went directly to my room and closed the door behind me, not to hide, but to think without interruption, because now every decision mattered in a way it had not before, and I needed to move carefully, not slowly but precisely. I sat at my desk and opened the notebook again, turning to the pages where I had written down all 93 payments, and for the first time I did not just see them as evidence, I saw them as steps in a sequence, each one connected, each one something I could undo. I picked up a pen and began marking them, not randomly but methodically, grouping them by date, by source, by pattern, understanding which ones could be stopped immediately and which ones required a different kind of approach. And as I worked through the list, I felt something shift inside me, not fear, not hesitation, but control, returning piece by piece. Downstairs, I could hear Rebecca moving through the kitchen, the sound of cabinets opening and closing, the rhythm of her routine unchanged, and for a moment I realized how completely unaware she still was. How certain she must have been that everything was secure, that I would never question any of it, and that certainty was exactly what gave me the advantage now. I closed the notebook and reached for my phone, not to make a call, but to review the access points again, the logins, the linked accounts, the permissions that had been quietly expanded over time, and I began mapping them out in my mind, where each one led, how they connected, what would happen if one piece was removed. Later that evening, I joined them for dinner as I always did, sitting in the same chair, responding in the same calm tone, allowing the routine to continue as if nothing had changed, because I understood now that disruption would come soon enough, but it had to come on my terms. Daniel mentioned something about upcoming expenses, something about planning ahead, and I nodded, letting him speak, watching the confidence in his posture, the ease with which he assumed authority over things that were never his to begin with, and I realized that this was not just about what they had taken. It was about what they believed they had become, the ones in charge, the ones making decisions, the ones who no longer needed my input. Rebecca glanced at me once briefly, as if checking for something, maybe hesitation, maybe confusion, but she found neither, because I gave her nothing to read, nothing to interpret, just the same calm presence she had grown used to overlooking. That night, after they had gone to bed, I returned to my room and placed the notebook beside the folder, both of them now complete in a way they had not been before. And I sat there for a long moment, not rushing, not second-guessing, just acknowledging that everything was ready. I understood exactly what needed to be done, exactly how it would unfold, and most importantly, exactly why it would work, because they had built everything on the assumption that I would remain passive, that I would continue trusting without verifying, that I would never act. I turned off the light and lay down, not restless this time, not uncertain but steady, because for the first time since all of this began, I was not reacting to their actions. I was preparing my own, and when the morning came, nothing in this house would change on the surface, but underneath everything would begin to shift. The next morning began like every other, quiet, predictable, the kind of routine that makes people believe nothing is about to change, and that was exactly why it worked. I made my coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and waited until I heard the front door close behind Daniel and Rebecca, their voices fading as they left for the day, unaware that their certainty was about to be tested. I did not rush, I did not move with urgency, because this was not about speed, it was about precision, and every step needed to happen in the right order. I took my phone and logged into the account, navigating directly to the list I had memorized the night before, 93 entries, each one familiar now, each one something I could undo. I hovered over the first one for a moment, not out of doubt, but to acknowledge what it represented, a decision made without me, repeated month after month until it became invisible, and then I pressed cancel. The confirmation appeared instantly, a small message on the screen that seemed insignificant on its own, But I knew better because that single action had already changed. Something they relied on, I moved to the next one and then the next, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, cancel, confirm, each click removing another piece of what they thought was secure. As I worked through the list, I began to notice the structure more clearly, how certain payments were timed to align with others, how access points overlapped, how everything had been arranged to function smoothly without drawing attention. And with each cancellation, I could almost see that structure weakening, not collapsing yet, but shifting in ways they would not be able to ignore for long. Halfway through, I paused and reviewed what I had done, not to check for mistakes but to understand the impact, and I realized that by the time I finished, the effects would not be immediate chaos, they would be subtle at first, a decline charge here, a missed payment there, small disruptions that would force questions, and those questions would lead back to the one thing they had never expected me. I continued until the last entry was gone, 93 cancellations, each one confirmed, each one recorded. And when I finally set the phone down, the silence in the room felt different, not empty but settled, as if something that had been out of balance for a long time had just been corrected. I did not celebrate, I did not react, because this was only the beginning, not the end, and I knew that the real impact would come later, when they started to notice, when their assumptions began to fail one by one. I closed the account and placed my phone on the table, then walked through the house slowly, not checking anything, not searching for confirmation, just taking in the space as it was now, knowing that underneath the surface, everything had already begun to change. By the time I heard their car pulling into the driveway that evening, I was sitting in my usual place, calm, composed, exactly as they expected me to be, and when they walked in, carrying on as if the day had been no different from any other, I realized something with complete clarity: they still believed they were in control, and that belief was about to become their biggest mistake. The first sign came quietly, exactly as I expected. Not with a confrontation, not with raised voices, but with confusion, the kind that begins as a small inconvenience and slowly grows into something harder to ignore. Rebecca was the first to notice, standing in the kitchen the next morning with her phone in her hand, her expression tightening just slightly as she tapped the screen again and again, as if repetition might change the outcome. And when she looked up at Daniel, her voice was controlled but edged with something new, something uncertain, saying that one of the payments had not gone through. Daniel frowned, not alarmed yet, just irritated, the way someone reacts when something disrupts a routine they have come to rely on, and he said he would check it later, that it was probably a system error, nothing to worry about. I sat at the table, stirring my coffee slowly, not looking at them directly, but listening to every word, every shift in tone, because this was the moment where the structure I had dismantled would begin to show its cracks. By midday, the second sign appeared, a notification on Daniel's phone this time, something about a decline charge, and I watched as his posture changed, just slightly, his confidence interrupted by something he could not immediately explain, and Rebecca moved closer to him, her voice lower now, asking if he had changed anything, if there was an issue with the account, and he shook his head, saying no, everything should be fine. That word, should, hung in the air longer than either of them realized, because it carried the assumption that nothing had changed, and that assumption was no longer true. The rest of the day unfolded in small disruptions, one after another: a subscription paused, a service interrupted, an automatic payment that simply did not happen, each one minor on its own, but together forming a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. By the time evening came, the tension in the house had shifted, no longer invisible, no longer beneath the surface, but present in the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way Rebecca checked her phone more frequently than usual, her calm beginning to fracture into something sharper. Daniel tried to maintain control, making calls, checking accounts, speaking in the firm tone he used when he believed he could solve a problem through logic alone. But I could see it now, the hesitation, the momentary pauses where certainty used to be. They did not ask me anything, not yet, because in their minds I was not part of this equation. I was not someone who would understand what was happening, let alone someone who could have caused it, and that was exactly why they were unprepared. I finished my dinner quietly and placed my plate in the sink, moving through the kitchen with the same steady rhythm I had always had, and as I passed Rebecca, I noticed the way her eyes followed me for just a second longer than before, as if something did not quite fit, as if a question was beginning to form that she was not ready to ask. I went to my room without a word, closing the door behind me, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself a moment to acknowledge what was happening. Not with satisfaction, not with relief, but with clarity, because everything was unfolding exactly as it needed to, and they were only just beginning to realize that something they had taken for granted was no longer theirs to control. By the third day, the confusion was no longer quiet. It had turned into urgency, the kind that fills a house without anyone raising their voice, and I could feel it in the way Rebecca moved faster than usual in the way Daniel stayed on his phone longer, stepping into other rooms to take calls he did not want me to overhear. That morning, I found them already at the kitchen table when I walked in, both of them staring at a laptop screen, their conversation stopping the moment they noticed me, and for a brief second something passed between them, a silent agreement that I was not part of whatever was happening. I poured my coffee slowly, giving them time because I knew the question would come. It was only a matter of when. Daniel spoke first, his tone controlled but tighter than I had ever heard it, asking if I had noticed anything unusual with the accounts, if I had received any notifications or emails, and I looked at him for a moment before answering, not hesitating, not rushing, just steady, saying that I had been organizing my finances recently, that I had been reviewing things more carefully. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her expression sharpened by something she was trying to hide. Asking what I meant by reviewing, her voice still polite but no longer casual, and I met her gaze without looking away, explaining that I had simply been going through old statements, making sure everything was accurate. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, because for the first time, they were not certain of their position, and that uncertainty had nowhere to go but toward me. Daniel cleared his throat and said that some payments had been declined, that services were being interrupted, that things were not functioning the way they should, and I nodded as if this was information I was hearing for the first time, even though I knew every detail behind it. Rebecca spoke again, more directly now, asking if I had made any changes, if I had contacted the bank, and I could see it in her eyes, the realization forming, slow but undeniable, that the situation was not random. I set my cup down gently and folded my hands in front of me, not defensive, not aggressive, just composed, and I said that I had taken a closer look at my accounts, that I had noticed several transactions I did not recognize, and that I had decided to address them. Daniel's expression shifted, not to anger, but to something more fragile, a loss of control he could not immediately recover from, and he asked what exactly I had done, his voice lower now, as if volume might change the outcome. I held his gaze and answered simply, I canceled what did not belong, and for a moment no one spoke. Rebecca's composure cracked first, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the tension underneath, asking why I would do that without discussing it, why I would disrupt things that had been running smoothly, and I felt something settle inside me again. That same clarity that had guided every step so far. I did not raise my voice, I did not explain in detail, I simply said that anything done in my name should have been discussed with me first, that anything taken without my understanding was never truly authorized, and that I had corrected that. The room went quiet after that, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were realizing something they had not considered before, that the person they had dismissed was now the one making decisions again. And as I picked up my cup and took another sip, I could see it clearly, the shift had already happened, and there was nothing they could do to reverse it. Daniel did not speak right away after I finished, and that silence told me more than anything he could have said, because for the first time, he was not certain how to respond to me, not as a son correcting his mother, but as someone realizing the ground beneath him had shifted. Rebecca, however, did not stay quiet for long, her voice rising just enough to reveal the pressure building underneath, asking how I could make such decisions without including them, how I could disrupt everything they had been managing, and I turned my attention to her slowly, not reacting to the tone, only to the words, because this was no longer about emotion, it was about clarity. I told her that management without consent is not help, that access without understanding is not trust, and that anything done in my name belongs to me first always, and as I spoke, I watched the way her expression changed, the confidence slipping into something sharper, something defensive. Daniel tried to step in then, his voice lower, more controlled, saying that they had only been trying to make things easier for me, that I had agreed to let them handle things, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging the part that was true, because I had allowed it, I had trusted them, but I also understood now how that trust had been used. I reached for the folder I had placed on the counter days before and opened it in front of them, not dramatically, not forcefully, just placing the documents where they could see them, each page marked, each transaction highlighted, and I let the silence do the work as their eyes moved across the evidence they had never expected me to gather. Rebecca's hand tightened slightly against the table as she read, and Daniel's posture shifted, his shoulders no longer squared with certainty but angled with something closer to unease, And I realized then that this was the moment they began to understand the full extent of what had changed. I did not accuse them, I did not raise my voice, I simply explained what I had done, that I had reviewed every transaction, that I had cancelled what was not mine, and that I had already taken steps to secure my accounts moving forward. Rebecca tried to speak again, something about misunderstanding, about how these things could be explained, but her words lacked the structure they once had, because explanations only work when control is still intact, and that control was gone. Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me, not as someone to guide or correct, but as someone he no longer recognized in the same way, and there was something in his expression that might have been regret, or perhaps just the realization that he had misjudged me completely. I held his gaze without softening, without hardening, simply present, and I told him one more thing, that trust is not something you assume will remain after it has been used without respect, that it has to be maintained, not managed. The room felt smaller after that, not physically, but in the way the space between us had changed, no longer defined by routine or assumption, but by something more direct, more honest. I closed the folder and placed it back on the counter, not as a threat but as a fact, something that existed whether they wanted to accept it or not, and as I stood up from the table, I understood that whatever they said next would not change what had already been set in motion, because this was no longer a conversation about what had happened, it was the beginning of what would happen next, and for the first time that future did not include their control over me. The next morning, I did not wait for another conversation, I did not wait for another explanation, because there was nothing left to discuss, only actions that needed to be completed. I returned to Mr. Harrison's office with the full documentation, every page, every transaction, every record of access, and this time there was no hesitation in the process, everything moved forward with quiet efficiency, formal notices drafted, account ownership reaffirmed, unauthorized activity flagged for review, and by the time I signed the final set of documents, the situation had already shifted beyond what Daniel and Rebecca could undo with words. Later that afternoon, the bank initiated a formal investigation into the extended use of my accounts, not as an accusation, but as a matter of compliance, which meant every transaction they had relied on would now be examined under scrutiny they could not avoid. And within hours, the consequences began to take shape. Access fully revoked, pending transactions frozen, and notifications sent that made it clear this was no longer a private matter contained within the walls of our home. When I returned to the house, they were already waiting, the calm from previous days completely gone, replaced by a tension that filled the room before a single word was spoken, and Daniel stepped forward first, his voice strained, asking what I had done, what was happening with the accounts, why everything was being locked down. I did not rush my answer, I did not match his urgency, I simply told him the truth in the same steady tone I had used all along, that I had restored control over what was mine, that I had ensured everything was being handled properly, and that anything done without my knowledge would now be reviewed accordingly. Rebecca tried to intervene, her voice sharper now, no longer controlled, asking if I understood what this would do, how this would affect them, and I looked at her without anger, without hesitation, and said that I understood exactly, because I had taken the time to understand everything they had done. I placed a copy of the legal notice on the table between us, not as a threat but as a fact, outlining the revocation of access, the investigation into unauthorized transactions, and the immediate restructuring of all financial control under my sole authority. And as they read, the reality settled in, not all at once but in pieces, each line removing another assumption they had relied on. Daniel's expression shifted again, this time not just uncertain but exposed, as if he was finally seeing the full consequence of decisions he had never expected to be questioned, and Rebecca, for all her composure, could not mask the realization that this was no longer something she could redirect or manage. I did not argue, I did not defend, because there was nothing left to prove, everything had already been documented, confirmed, and acted upon. I picked up my keys from the counter and paused for a moment, not to reconsider, but to acknowledge what was ending, not just the situation, but the version of my life where I had allowed others to decide for me. I told Daniel one last thing, that respect is not given through control, and trust is not maintained through silence, and that both had been broken long before I ever opened that first statement. Then I walked out, not in anger, not in retreat, but with a clarity that felt stronger than anything I had experienced in years, because I was not leaving something behind, I was reclaiming what had always been mine. By the end of that week, everything was finalized, accounts secured, assets reassigned, and a new will signed. that reflected exactly what I had learned, that those who take without respect do not inherit what they did not help build. And as I sat in my new office, reviewing documents that now answered only to me, I understood the full weight of what had happened, not as loss but as correction. They had believed I was too old to understand, too removed to notice, too dependent to act, but in the end, the only thing they proved was how completely they had underestimated the one person who had been watching all along, and when it mattered most, I did not raise my voice, I did not ask for permission. I simply took everything back and left them with exactly what they had earned, nothing but the consequences of their own decisions.